Sophia meaning wisdom. Now, in the legendary origin of the word, they say that Berquist was the first man to call himself a philosopher. He was not the first philosopher, but the first man to call himself a philosopher. And the occasion for it that's recounted is that he had discovered some wonderful things like the Pythagorean theorem and the other things. And so his contemporaries started to call him wise. Okay? And Pythagoras is supposed to reply, "Don't call me wise." God alone is wise, he said. What shall we call you then, huh? Well, if you have to call me something, call me a lover of the sun. So in the origin of the name, though not in the etymology of the name, right, there's also an element of what? Humility, right? The wisdom of man is nothing compared to the wisdom of God. Huh? And you find that same thought running through the other great Greek philosophers. And obviously the Christian philosophers say that even more strongly. So you get to, say, Heraclitus, who's in some ways the central thinker in human thought, and he has his two wonderful proportions. As an ape is to a man, so is man to God. As an ape, is inferior to man in beauty and wisdom and everything else. So man is like that to God. The ape is to man. Or, his other proportion was, as a child is to a man, so is man to God. And so to the child, the man appears to be wise, right? But in comparison to God, man is not wise. Biologists call us Homo sapiens, which means the wise ape. Compared to the ape, we look wise, right? But compared to God, we're like an ape. They find that same thought in Socrates, right? In the Apologies and elsewhere. The Oracle of Delphi said that no one is wiser than Socrates, right? And Socrates said, what does that mean? Because he knew he was ignorant of many things. And the first thing he realized that he's not wise in the way God would be wise, right? Maybe wise in some human sense. So he's not wise in the full sense. In Plato's last work, which is usually considered to be the Laws, right? He quotes Protagoras, who said, "Man is the measure of all things." And Plato says, no. God is the measure of all things. Same idea, right? We'll see in this premium that Aristotle says, either we should say God alone is wise, right? Or only God in the full complete sense. Now that humility, of course, is found even more profoundly in people like Augustine or Thomas or the Christian philosophers in general, but it was lost among the famous modern philosophers. Hume, say, or Marx and so on. The human reason is the supreme mind, the reason of the universe, right? So to understand what a lover of wisdom is, we have to know something about what wisdom is, and then how the philosopher must love wisdom. So this premium of Aristotle's to wisdom is the best short premium to what wisdom aims at and what kind of knowledge it is. Okay? Now the word premium is a Greek word originally, meaning paving the way. There is the way, right? The premium is something shorter than an introduction, right? Introduction means what? Leading you into it. So in college, say, a whole course might be called Introduction to some subject, right? But a premium is something very short, like the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, 14 lines. That in some way prepares the way for what comes afterwards. If you look at the Dei Verbum in Vatican II, I first had an English copy of it. In the very beginning, it says introduction. It's not introduction. You're getting that. Not introduction. Then I got the official Latin text, and it says premium. And it's magnificent premium, that one to do here, right? And just about all of Aristotle's works have a premium to them. So we're going to look at this premium to get an idea of what wisdom aims at and the kind of knowledge it is. Let's look at the first sentence in this premium. Aristotle says, all men by nature desire to know. Now the word there in Greek, at the end of the sentence, is eidemai, right? Which could be translated to know, and it usually is translated to know, but it could also be taken in a more particular sense, meaning to understand. And either way you take it, it makes sense. But when he gives in the second sentence a sign from the senses, right? If you take the first sentence as referring to knowing in general, well, sensing is a kind of knowing, sense knowing. But if you take eidemai there to mean to understand, which it usually does in Aristotle, right? There's kind of a likeness, whereby we carry the word to see over to understanding sometimes, right? Or even Gregory the Great speaks of reason as the eye of the soul. He says, anger disturbs the eye of the soul. Okay? Now, I usually ask big questions about this first statement. One is, what does it mean? Okay? Two, is it true? And three, why does he begin with that statement? Now, when he says all men, does he mean men as opposed to women, let's say? Huh? Or men as opposed to boys, huh? No. Okay? It's a common one, right now. When he says by nature, what does he mean? Okay. The word nature in Latin, or the Greek word physis, it first means birth. And so we kind of lose that a little bit in English, right? But it's like if you said that this desire is inborn, right? It's not something that grows by custom or fashion, but the source of this desire is within, right? Nature is always something within. Huh? Just like the baby comes from within the woman. Huh? Okay? Now, I think you all know what the word desire means, huh? And as I mentioned, we can understand that last word, either to know in the broad sense or to understand, referring to reason in particular, right? Okay. Now, the second question, is that statement true? And notice the sign that Aristotle gives. He says, a sign of this is that men do scientific experiments? No. A sign of this is that men do historical research? No. A sign of this is that men philosophize? No, right? He takes a sign from something that is common to all of us. And that's the love of the senses. Huh? And does everybody, or is anybody else, put it this way, is anybody who doesn't sometimes use his eyes not to make or do something, but just to see something? Look at that beautiful sunset, right? We won't see it today, but Look at those beautiful mountains, right? Or, you know, people hang up on their living room wall sometimes a painting or a reproduction of a famous painting, maybe a beautiful scene, right? You don't hang up the table weights and measures, do they? But that'd be more practical, right? So everybody uses their eyes sometimes just to see something, right? So they have a desire to know without anything, what? To make or do because of that, huh? Okay. You especially single out the eyes, because the eyes are the senses that have a sort of clarity in what they know, and they can know things at a distance, right? The sun and the moon and the stars would be lost to us, right, if we had no eyes. Okay. Now notice a second sign, which he doesn't give here, but he touches upon in the book about the poetic art, is that everybody enjoys stories, right? And as a child, when your mother was reading you, let's say, Little Red Riding Hood, you wanted to know what happens to Little Red Riding Hood when she gets to her grandmother's house, right? You're going to make her do something with that knowledge? No. But your wonder has been aroused. Okay? And so even practical people will have to get up in the morning and do something, right? Sometimes start to read a mystery story or watch a movie that's intriguing on TV or something, and they stay up beyond their, bedtime, right? And they'll be tired. They're not going to pick up something by watching the movie that will help them on the job tomorrow, and they'll be tired, right? But they have something, their wonder's been around. Want to see how it turns out. My cousin Donald is married to a very practical woman, right? No time for philosophy like that, right? But anyway, he was reading some Russian spy novel, right? And he finished it, was laying around the house, and she accidentally picked it up and said, look at it. And she got engrossed in it. And she was mad at Donnie that he had left the book around because she couldn't put it down, and she wasn't doing her gardening, or other practical things. See? So even a very practical woman has something of this desire, right? Huh? You see it in a baseball game, right? You'll see people sometimes in the ninth inning leaving the ballpark if the game is lopsided, right? But if it's in doubt who's going to win, right? You won't have that same number of people leaving the stands. Although that's a practical thing to do, right? To get out of the parking lot before you're jammed in there for an hour or two, right? Okay. So the statement here is true, right? It's the second thing you asked about. Now the third and last reason, why does Aristotle, you think, begin with this statement? What's this got to do with finding out about wonder and pursuing wisdom, finding out about wisdom? Yeah. Now notice, the fact that something is desired is a sign that is good. Huh? Okay. Now it's not a necessary sign, right? Because sometimes people desire things that are only apparently good, right? But when you have a natural desire for something, like you have a natural desire for food, water, and so on, right? Natural desire to sleep and so on. Well, that's a very good sign that water, food, and sleep are really, truly what? Good for us, right? So the fact that we have this natural desire to know, right? Wisdom is what we're finding out, the end of all of our knowledge, right? The highest knowledge. This way is preparing the way to see that, right? Okay. There's another kind of subtle thing that Thomas Aquinas mentions in his commentary, and that is that nature doesn't do superfluous things. The common rule for all natural philosophers, from the Greeks right to Einstein and Sir Isaac Newton, is that nature does nothing superfluous. So if nature gives man or the other animals a natural desire, it's for something that they need and they can in some way get. Huh? You may starve to death, right? But it's not in principle possible to get food, right? You may die of thirst out there in the Death Valley or something, right? But Why would nature give us thirst if there's nothing to drink? So the fact that nature has given us this natural desire to know, right, is a sign that it should be possible in some way. And this is against people who might think it's foolish to pursue wisdom, right? You know, like man can't know or something, right? Okay? That's like saying it's foolish to look for food, right? Where there's a natural desire, there's something naturally good and something that is in some way possible for the one that has been given by nature desire for it. Okay?
In the reading, we sort of touched upon that, I think, in the last class. In modern time especially, philosophers, so-called philosophers, seem to be denying what is most wisdom, exactly crazy wisdom. People are now denying the fact that we can know things, or know things. The Holy Father is supposed to develop that quite a bit and get us across modern crisis.
Oh yeah.
People just they used to overemphasize knowledge, and now they deny that we can know it. Say that we can know.
Yeah, I used to just stop by the office on the way here, you know, and there's some obviously advertising for books, you know, trying to sell me. You know? There's somebody talking about truth, you know, and why do we give up pursuing truth, you know, in the modern world? So, well, part of it is we don't follow nature. We'll come back to that when we get to the fourth thing in the introduction here to philosophy. Heraclitus says, wisdom is to speak the truth and to act according to nature, with an ear thereto. So we're already listening to nature there when we talk about this natural desire. Now, starting in the second paragraph, Aristotle is going to begin to talk about the first road in our knowledge. Now, the first road in our knowledge is the natural road in our knowledge. And the natural road in our knowledge is the road from the senses into reason. So just the first road is the natural road, right? And the natural road is the road from the senses into reason. Okay? Now let me manifest the minor premise first there. If you know what nature means, there's many senses. Take this common meaning of nature as what a thing is, right? Anything more fundamental than what a thing is? The thing must be what it is before it can be anything else, right? So nature is always what is first in the thing. So that's why the first road in our knowledge is the what? Natural road in our knowledge. Now the other premise, the major premise, why is the natural road in our knowledge, human knowledge, right, the road from the senses into reason? Well, what is man by nature? He's an animal with what? Reason, right? That's what man is by nature. Animals defined by having what? Senses, right? Man is not just an animal, but is an animal with what? Reason, right? And as you know, what is general develops before what is what? Particular. So when the, let's say the fertilized egg or something like that, right? What you first see is something like the plant, cell division, right? Growth, right? And then the use of the senses, and last of all, the use of reason, right? So the road is naturally, for an animal with reason, the road is naturally from the senses into what? Reason, right? Aristotle's going to talk a little bit about that road, right? We could at some time, talk more at length about the road. Huh? What Aristotle's going to talk about here is what comes first along that road, right? What comes second, what comes third, and what comes later on, and so on. Now, before we start to talk about that, why do you think he wants to talk about the natural road in our knowledge and where it's going, right, the direction it's going in order to get some glimpse of what wisdom might be about, what wisdom might be aiming at. Yeah. When I have a class of freshmen assumption, we talked a little bit about wisdom. I have a standard question I ask them just to get them to start to think about it. See what they have in mind about wisdom, very amorphous idea at first. I said, do you think wisdom comes in the beginning of our knowledge, or in the middle of our knowledge, or at the end? And a class of freshmen who've never thought about this really, they kind of all spontaneously answer where? At the end, right? So unless you see where the natural road is going, right, it's hard to get an idea of what the end or goal is going to be, right? Wisdom comes at the end of that. So he starts off from what's at the very beginning. He's going to talk about, at least three or four actually, and later on makes more distinctions, but four basic kinds of knowing on this road, right? And you'll see as you go from one to the next, you're moving in the direction of wisdom. And everybody recognizes that. And he says, now animals are born having sensation by nature, right? Now if you compare an animal that can sense and be aware to some extent of its surroundings, right, with a stone or even a tree that doesn't seem to be aware of its surroundings, the animal seems to be much more wise, right? In the tree, right? A limb of a tree doesn't even know you're doing it, right? Okay? Now he says, from this, memory does not arise in some of them, but does arise in others. Aristotle's talking about a low form of animal life. And I think he's probably thinking of an example from marine biology. Aristotle, after Plato's death, right, he left the age of minor. He engaged in marine biology. Now there's some forms of animal life where the animal doesn't move from one place to another. It's affixed, I guess, to the bottom of the ocean, right? And if you poke it or something comes in contact, it may surround it, right? But it doesn't seem to have any memory. All that it needs comes to it to know the currents of the water and so on, right? But all the higher animals, and man himself, of course, have in addition to sensing, but memory of what has been sensed, right? Now, who seems wiser? The animal that has sensing but no memory, or the animal that has memory? The old saying, in one ear and out the other. If I had no memory, everything would be like that. Would I ever go forward in my knowing? No, it's like a seed. Pour the water in, pours it out. You keep nothing of what you sense, right? My mother used to have an expression that I hear her use with the salesman when he's trying to sell something. He says, I wasn't born yesterday. But if you had no memory, you'd be no wiser than somebody born yesterday, right? You'd be no wiser than the newborn baby downtown, right? In the hospital. Huh? So memory represents a great advance, right? When I was a little boy, we had a male cat, and the cat was in the kitchen, and he smelled something cooking on the stove that smelled pretty good. So he tried to jump up on the stove, and his paw hit the, hot burner, electric stove. He fell to the ground. He never tried to do that again. He never, in my experience, ever tried to jump on the stove again. He was a wiser cat from then on, right? But he'd be no wiser if he didn't have what? Memory, right? So you see how you're moving in the direction of wisdom, even as you go from sensing to what? Having memory, right? Okay. Now, he mentions here, but kind of an aside, so don't go on it too much, but he's kind of contrasting the sense of hearing with the sense of sight, right? And the classic comparison is that the sense of sight is more the sense of discovery by yourself, right? The sense of hearing is the sense of learning from a teacher. That's why Thomas is always quoting St. Paul, in the Latin, fides ex auditu, right? Faith is from hearing. And if they don't send somebody to preach, right? How can they hear? How can they? Now, in the third paragraph, he speaks of a third stage here that comes after memory, but mainly in man. And this is what we could call what? Experience, right? Now, sometimes we use experience in a different sense than Aristotle is using it here. Sometimes if a man goes through some sensation that made a big impression on him, he broke your leg or some other horrible thing, that was quite an experience, you say, right? Okay. But that's really still a sensation, the memory of that sensation, right? He's taking experience here as a collection, a gathering together of many memories of the same sort of thing. So they say to the students, if a man has had one date with one woman in his life, he may remember it. Or if a woman has had one date with one man in her life, she may remember it. But should not seem, or he would not seem to be as wise as someone who's had many, right? Huh? Okay. Yes. If I run one political campaign, that's it, right? Don't seem as wise as the man who's been through 20 political campaigns, right? Okay. So the man of experience, to all of us, seems to be what? Wiser than the man of one memory, right? You get the wine expert, right? Huh? He hasn't just drunk one wine, he's drunk hundreds of wines, right? He has all these memories of the wines he's drunk gathered together in his head, right? He has an experience of wine, right? And so he seems much more knowing, much more knowledgeable about wine than the man of one memory. You see that? Okay. So again, you're going in the direction of wisdom. So if the animal that has memory seems wiser than the animal that has only sensation, right? And the man who has experience seems wiser than the man of one memory, right? Okay? Because the confirmation is the way to go, right? So in that third paragraph, he says, the other animals live by images and memories, but they share little in experience. In experience, you have something of the influence of reason already, because in experience, you're comparing things, right? Bringing them together. And that's what reason does. The race of men, however, lives by art and reason. So we're talking about that. So he says experience comes to be from memory in men, just as memory came to be from sensation, right? For many memories of the same sort of thing perfect the power of one experience. And now he's going to start to compare experience with the next step he wants to talk about, science or art, right? We'll see what the differences are. And experience seems to be very much like science and art. For science and art come to men through experience. What's the difference that he sees in this fourth paragraph between experience and art or science? What's the first difference he sees here in this fourth paragraph? Later on, he's going to see another difference too. What difference does he see in this fourth paragraph? Okay. What's the transition from experience to the beginning of art or science? Yeah. Experience is still a knowledge of many singulars, right? Many individual things. Just as sensing and memory are knowledge of singular. But when I see many things of the same sort, and I see something common to them, I begin to separate out what they have in common. Okay? So if you took an aspirin, your headache went away, right? And I remember that. You took an aspirin, your headache went away, right? And I started to compare these many memories I have of people taking aspirin and headaches going away. I might see something kind of general there, right? But aspirin is good for headaches, right? Okay. For experience makes art, as Paulus says, he's a character in one of Plato's dialogues. Speaking rightly, but inexperience, what? Chance. Beginner's luck, right? The man has no experience sometimes. By luck or by chance, he does something better than the man, who has experience. So art comes to be whenever one universal understanding. I know the universal is something one, common to many, right? Said of many, right? Comes about whenever one universal understanding about like things. Comes to be from the many things kept in the mind by experience. And he gives an example from the old medical art, right? Aristotle's father was the court physician at the court of Macedonia, right? And that's Aristotle became known at the court of Macedonia. He became an instructor of future Alexander the Great. His father was the medical physician for King Philip, right, of Macedonia. Now, you're going to notice here in the fifth paragraph here at the bottom of page 1. Aristotle's not going to jump and say, now, art or science is clearly superior to experience, right? Like experience is superior to memory, right? And memory, the animal has memory to the animal has only sensation, right? It's going to be much more nuanced here, right? Okay. And in fact, in terms of this first difference between the two of them, that experience is a knowledge of singulars, and art or science is a knowledge of universal, he's going to point out that the man of experience, in doing something, right, in something practical, sometimes succeeds better than the man of art or science. Okay? And he's going to give as a reason for that the fact that when you do something, you're not doing universal. You're not curing man, you're curing this man right here, right? This individual man, right? And experience is closer to the singular, it's the knowledge of the singular. So he says, as far as doing is concerned, experience does not seem to differ at all from art. But we see the experience succeeding more than those having reason without experience. The cause is that experience is knowledge of singulars, while art is of universals. That's the first difference we talked about. But all doings and makings are about singulars. The doctor does not cure man except accidentally. He cures Callias, this individual, right? Or Socrates, as one of them is so named. Happens to be a man, right? So he says if someone has reason without experience and knows universal, but does not know the singularness, he many times makes a mistake in medical treatment. For it is more the singular that is treated. When my wife was giving birth to the first baby, after she gave birth to the first baby, they give these women a standard dose of Demerol, which is kind of a pain killer and makes them, release some of the discomfort and so on. When they gave the usual dose to my wife, she got violent headaches. So the second baby, she gave birth to the second baby, they brought out the standard dose, she says, just give me half of that, right? And that was just right for her, right? Huh? So she was, in one sense, a better what? Yeah, she was a better, treater of herself than the nurse or the doctor who has a standard, right? But they gave everybody the same thing, right? And in the case of this woman, that's too much for her, right? You see that? I remember when I was a freshman in college, and I was in these general requirement courses, general psychology course, right? And the man who taught the course, he would go in the afternoon to the local mental hospital, right? And I remember him saying, he says that there really aren't enough psychologists on the staff to get to know the patients individually. So he says, what happens, he says, is that when a patient comes in, They classify him or her. And then he or she gets the standard treatment for whatever the universal ailment that they're under. And he said he found in many cases it made them worse. You know? That's an example of what Aristotle was talking about, right? And notice you, as an amateur psychologist, if your friend is depressed, right? Or if you're a mother and a father and your little boy or girl is depressed about something, you as a friend or as a mother and father who knows this individual in particular might know exactly what to suggest, right? That would pick them up out of this depression, right? You might know it better than the what? Yeah, at least all the classifications, all these different diseases, and so on. Huh? So a man that's been down in the U.S. Congress for 20 years, he could get a piece of legislation through Congress better than a political scientist who studies comparative government rights and knows the difference between the American form of government and the English form of government and the French and German and all these ones, right? But you don't get a piece of legislation through government in general. You get it through the U.S. Congress or French National Assembly or English Parliament or something, right? And I know I've got to kind of, come with us pieces together. The LBJ would say, So that's the first difference in terms that he gives between art or science and experience. The one is a knowledge of singulars, the other of the universal. And he doesn't try to reason from that difference to say that art or science is superior. In fact, he reasons to a certain superiority of the man of experience. Huh? Okay? Now, when I was a student in Quebec, sometimes an American, indigent American students, would get a job teaching conversational English, right? It's not through a formal course, right? You have a bunch of secretaries in there and other people who have to learn some English, right? To conduct business in those days. But despite it being a kind of informal course, you would from time to time get a question about the English grammatical rule. And these young American students realize they don't really know the rules. So what do they have of English language? Yeah, but they have the experience of English, right? And they might speak English better than, someone who studied English in a formal way and knows the various rules of English grammar, right? But that rule is something universal. Right? When I was teaching college, my wife used to teach grade school. And of course, the most common mistake in spelling on a student's paper is I and E. You think one before the other, right? And of course, reading all the time for a living, I recognize right away the word is misspelled, right? I said to Rosie, isn't there a rule about that? Oh, yeah. I before E, except that just E, or it sounded like A is a neighboring way. I couldn't, come out and take out the universal rule. But that's the beginning of the art or science of English grammar. Okay. You study, Latin, and you notice how they might put the adjective after the noun, right? And in English, we tend to put the adjective before the noun, right? You may not formulate that universal rule, right? You just do it automatically because you have experience of writing English. But now in the first complete paragraph of page 2, he's going to reason that nevertheless, the man of art or science is more knowing than the man of experience. And he's wise of experience. But this is in terms of another difference between the two. And that is that experience tells us only that something is so. But the man of art or science, if his art or science is somewhat complete, knows why this is so, right? Okay. So he says, nevertheless, we think that knowing and understanding belong more to art or science than experience. And we hold that the artists are wiser than the experience, so that wisdom follows knowledge and all. It's more a matter of knowing than doing, right? Now the reason for this is because the men of art or science know the cause, while the others do not. The experienced know that it is so, but do not know why it is so. But these know why it is so, and the what? Cause. So someone might know from experience that knowledgeable people in wine and so on, they store their wine bottles on their what? Side, right? You know that this is done, right? But they don't know what. Why? The reason why, as I've often explained, is that when it stands up, the cork dries out. And then eventually air can get in and spoil the wine, right? When it lays on its side, the wine gets into the cork expands and makes a nice seal, right? I'm a tea drinker, huh? Now I know from experience that if you leave the water in contact with the tea leaves, say for 7 minutes, something like that, 10 minutes, you're going to get a bad tasting what? Tea. Okay? Now, your first kind of, attitude for this is, well, it gets too strong. That's not what happens. It doesn't get too strong. In that case, you just dilute it, right? What actually happens is that there are different chemicals released after especially 7 minutes. Chemicals that are disagreeable in their case compared to ones. Right? So the chemist is a man of art or science, right? To explain how different chemicals, right, for a reason he knows, are released at different times, right? Okay? So he knows why something that I know is so, and therefore he seems to me wiser than me. He seems to be illuminated, right? Okay? We think we're wiser than the ancients because we think we know why there's day and night. The ancients knew as well as us that there's day and night, right? Everybody from experience knows there's day and night, right? But not everybody knows that the earth is turning on its axis. Okay? Now again, even without going through this whole text with students, sometimes I'll ask students this question. I'll say, what do you think is wiser, the man who knows the way things are, or the man who doesn't know the way things are? Of course, the obvious answer is the man who knows the way things are. And I say, now, among those who know the way things are, who's wiser? The man who knows the way things are, but not why they are the way they are, or the man who knows why? Aristotle against the answer. The man knows why, right? So this is the reason why art or science seems to be what? More knowing, man of art or science, and more like wisdom, because he knows why, he knows the cause, right? So notice the nuanced treatment of Aristotle there, right? In terms of the first difference, he doesn't try to reason that wisdom or that art or science is superior to experience. In fact, he reasons to its inferiority. But from the second difference, he reasons to the superiority, right? So this is introducing us to the idea now that wisdom, the wise man, knows causes, right? He knows why things are the way they are, right? Now, that's so important a point for what he's developing in the beginning of this premium. He wants to stop now, right? And manifest in the next few paragraphs in 3 different ways that the man who knows why and the cause would be considered by all of us wiser, right? Than the man who doesn't know why, who doesn't know the cause. Huh? Now the first kind of example he uses in the second complete paragraph here on page 2, he compares the chief artist with the subordinate artist, and we take, any example you want to this from any of the arts. Whence also we think that the chief artists about each thing are more honorable and know more and are wiser than the handicraftsmen. because they know the causes of things made. The latter are like inanimate things. They make, but they do not know what they make, as fire burns. Inanimate things make each of these by certain nature, a reason, and knowing the causes. Let's take an example of this. Let's take the medical doctor and the pharmacist, right? And the medical doctor would be the chief artist, right? And the pharmacist the subordinate one, right? And we all would think that the medical doctor is wiser and more knowing than the pharmacist. And the sign of that is that he commands the pharmacist what to do, right? He gives them a prescription which the pharmacist is supposed to follow, right? Now the pharmacist, as pharmacist, doesn't have to know why you need that medication. He may, pick this up, but then he has a little bit of medical art himself, right? But as pharmacist, he has to be able to follow the prescription and make the medicine or select the medicine, right, that he gives to you, right? But we all think that the doctor is a little bit higher in profession, a little more honorable, right, than the pharmacist, right? Because he knows why you need that, right? You see that? Yeah. So look what Aristotle is doing. He's taking something we all recognize. The doctor is being wiser and more noble, more honorable in his profession, but you can see that he's the guy who knows more why than the pharmacist. Right? Take the military art, right? So Napoleon is the chief artist, right? In the military art there. And let's say you're the head of the cavalry, right? And you're under strict orders to not charge until you hear the trumpet. Until you hit the sign for me, Napoleon, right? Now, as head of the cavalry, you have to know how to lead the charge, but you have to know why you shouldn't charge until the trumpet. But the great Napoleon, he's got a battle plan to win the battle. Right? And there's a time in which if the cavalry charges before that, or too late, it'd be too late or too early, right? So he knows why this is the best time for them to do, right? The percentage of each other doesn't know what he's doing, but if he's really, managed to do that, right? And the famous poem we used to memorize when I was a kid, the battle of the Crimean War, right? Charge the Light Brigade. There is not to question why, there is but to do and die. The general might not know what they're doing in that case, right? I used to work in the factory with my brother Mark, see, and being my older brother, he was kind of in charge, right? And sometimes he'd tell me to do something, and I'd say to him, why? Why do this stuff like that? He said, hey, you're not paid to think, he says, you're just paid to do it. But you're thinking it's text, right? You're funny with me, That's true, right? I'm not paid to think, right? Just to do this, right? Sometimes in grade school, you have someone teaching the children how to print and how to write. And sometimes if you have a large class, they'll get somebody who has no education really in these things, who's kind of an assistant, right? And the chief teacher, you might say, right, tells everyone what to watch out for the children, right? I remember this one example. When you're printing, like say the letter C, right? Well, some children will start with C at the bottom and go like that. Other children will do it like this. And the chief teacher tells the assistant, make sure they form their C on the top. This is printing, right? Now, it doesn't really make any difference as far as printing letter C, whether you do this or this. But why was the teacher insisting that they do this from the top, down, and around, rather than the bottom up? Why? Yeah. Now I start to write the letter cat, the word cat, right? If I start at the top, I do like this. There's a break there, right? Huh? So in other words, she knows the reason why, right? The other person doesn't. That's Aristotle's first main example there. The second one is from the ability to teach. So we think of the teacher as being wiser, right, than those he teaches, at least in the matters about which he teaches them. Now, can one teach fully if you don't know why? The students say, why? And you say, well, when you get to be my age, you'll see it. Well, then I'm kind of asking for you to, believe me, right? But that's not teaching in the full sense. I was just teaching in California there at St. Mary's there, and this one student was leading a somewhat immoral life, right? He was driving the priest crazy because what's wrong with, fornication, what's wrong with that, and so on. And so they weren't so good at giving the reasons why, whether they knew these things were bad, right? So he'd come to me because I'd give him the reason why these things are bad, right? So he regarded me as wiser, right, than the man who knows that it's bad, but can't explain why it's bad. Right? So sometimes, just from living, your parents know things, right? You should listen to them because of their experience, right? But they don't seem as wise as the teacher could explain why it's good and why that's bad, or why this is better and this works, right? Now, the last way he reasons in the fourth complete paragraph on page 2 he's making kind of a contrast here, right? To put it in the form of either argument. His wisdom consists in a knowledge of the singular, and that is so. Or in a knowledge of the universal, and why it's so. Got to be one or the other, right? Now, if you say it's about the singular, and that is so, what absurdity follows? No, but he's doing something different. It's a different argument, right? If you said that wisdom consists more in knowing the singular, and that is so, than the universal, why it is so, then sensation would be wisdom. Because what's most authoritative as far as singular? If I remember your eyes, you can color your eyes. Someday you'll do wrong, right? I look at your eyes, right? Trust the senses, don't you? Go back and look at something, and it's no different than the way you remember it, right? Okay? So experience is based on memory, and memory is not as authoritative as the senses. Are you sitting? So nothing more authoritative than the senses. You have all kinds of theories why you're sitting. But that you are sitting, nothing is more certain than the senses. So if wisdom consists in knowing the singular, and that is so, sensation be wisdom, but nobody thinks that is wisdom. Aristotle goes into the next part here, talking about different arts or sciences. What threefold distinction does he make? We're kind of going into different arts and sciences.
Right. Some useful.
Yeah, for necessities, right? Yeah. Which seems wiser, Carpenter or Shakespeare? Mm-hmm. He'll develop that consequence a little bit more. Now, he's using the word art and science here roughly for any knowledge of the universal, right? And why it is so, right? But more precise distinctions, he says, he made in the sixth book of the Ethics. But that for the sake of which we have now made a discourse is this, that all hold what is called wisdom to be about the first causes and beginnings. And it's going a little bit further than he wants to go here. He says first causes, right? So as has been said before, the experienced man seems to be wiser than any of those having sensation. The artist or scientist and the experienced. The chief artist and the handicraftsman, right? The looking science is more than the making, right? Now notice, in our own age, which is a very practical age, you might say, well, that's so hard to see, right? But notice how they made Einstein man of the century, and see if it's justified or not, Time magazine, right? Remember that man of the century? Einstein, right? So you're thinking of Einstein in terms of his knowing, not in terms of his what? Doing or making, yeah. Even the popular books like Dick and Barnett, The Universe of Dr. Einstein. Right? They admire Einstein because he seems to have understood the whole universe. Right? Einstein says, I'm not concerned with the details, I want to see the whole universe, right? Okay. So even there you see a little bit of the theoretical, right? The looking knowledge is having more the character of wisdom, right? But notice he kind of draws back from the idea of first beginnings and causes and says, thus it is clear that wisdom is about beginnings and causes. Okay. Now in the second reading he's going to push this further, right? And say that wisdom is aiming not just at any causes, because every art or science aims at some causes. Wisdom is going to aim at the very what? First causes. He's also going to point out that wisdom is about not just universal, but what's most universal. So wisdom is going to be about what is said of all. That's one thing. But most of all, about what is the cause of all, right? And it would get its nobility and excellence from speaking about the first causes, not from speaking about what is said of all, right? But that's anticipated in the first reading, right? And the superiority of art or science or of experience is not in terms of knowing universal, but knowing the cause. Okay? Any question then about that first reading, huh?
So if we review the
Well, you have the natural desire spoken of briefly at the beginning, right? This paragraph. And almost the whole rest of it is in terms of an actual what? Road, right? Okay.
Yeah.
But the chief conclusion is that wisdom is about causes, right? The man who knows why, who's the chief artist, right? Or the teacher or whatever, he's the man who knows why is wiser. Obviously, wisdom must in some way be a knowledge of causes. Okay? So now he wants to say in the second reading, more precisely, what causes is it about, right? So he begins by saying, since we seek such knowledge, the knowledge of causes, that is to say, right? This ought to be considered. About what sort of causes and about what sort of beginnings is wisdom and knowledge? Huh? Perhaps it would be clearer if one took the thoughts we have about the wise man. And that's not the editorial we, it's meaning we human beings in general have about the wise man or about wisdom. Right? Aristotle is going to work out a 6-part description of wisdom for the wise man. And he's going to reason from the first 3 of those parts to wisdom being about what is said of all, and for the last 3 it's being about the first causes. Okay? But notice you have enough material in the first reading to say, hey, who's wiser? The man who knows the cause, the man who really knows that himself. So the man who knows the cause. Who's wiser? What if the cause has a cause? Okay? You hit me. Why? Because you're angry with me, right? So anger is the cause of your hitting me, right? But anger is the kind of cause that has a cause, right? So why are you angry with me, right? So the man who knows the cause of the cause would obviously be wiser, right? And so on until you come to the first cause, assuming that there are first causes, right? Which is something that Aristotle shows in the second book, right? Okay. We're going to develop this more slowly, right? Now, the first thing we think about the wise man. We think first that the wise man knows all things so far as possible. Not having a knowledge of these in particular, because no one, human being, could know all things in particular, right? But we think in some way he knows all things in some general way, right? You hear people saying even in daily life, he's got it all together, right? What does that mean? He sees everything, right? At least in some general way, right? Even the pejorative sense of wise. What are you, a wise guy? What are you, a know-it-all? Right? You think of the wise man in some way knowing all about something, right? They can't know all about something in particular, but in general. Then we think wise, the one who is able to know things difficult and not easy for man to know. The sense is common to all, hence it is easy in the thing what? Wise. Okay? So we think of wisdom as being knowledge of things that are what? Difficult to know, right? And that's why we attach a certain honor to the wise man, right? He knows things that most men don't know, things that are difficult to know, right? Okay. Further, on this next paragraph, he's got two things, the third and the fourth one. Further, we think wiser in every science the man who's more certain or more sure. Okay. Now, take it by itself. You're not so sure about something, right? Don't you consult someone you think might be wiser in this matter than you? Even after I had my PhD in philosophy, I used to go up and see Monsieur Dion every Thanksgiving and every spring, every Easter vacation, right? And sometimes I send my questions ahead, right? But these are difficult questions, and I'd work out my own answer to the questions. And I'd ask what he thought of them, you know? And almost all the time he'd agree with my own answer, but once in a while he'd say something, right? And then if I thought about it again, I'd see he was right, I was wrong, right? Okay? But I go to him because he seems what? Wise, right? And notice a little paradox there, right? You're saying that wisdom is about things that are difficult for man to know, right? We think that about the wise man, right? We admire the wise man for knowing things that are difficult to know, right? We also think of the wise man as being more sure in what he says. And therefore we go to the wise man when we're in doubt, right? Now there's a little paradox there, right? Because how can the wise man be characterized by being more certain in what he knows, right? He's knowing things that are more difficult to know. The things that are easy to know that you can be more sure about it. Yet we have both of these opinions about the wise man, don't we? Reminds me when Aristotle talks about the soul and the anima, right? And he talks about the excellence of the knowledge of the soul, right? Because it's such a noble thing. But it's also excellent because of the great certitude we have about the soul. But then later on he says that to know what the soul is one of the most difficult things in the world. So how can the knowledge of the soul be most what? Certain Yet, a knowledge of the soul would be one of the most difficult knowledge in the world to acquire. Yeah. I mean, how can that which is difficult to know, right? Very difficult to know. How can that knowledge be characterized by certitude? But even if you've done everything you could do, right? It's still such a difficult thing to know. How can you be sure? Yeah, it's not what it is, right? Descartes saying this cogito ergo sum, right? As the objectors pointed out, this was really originally used by Augustine against the skeptical academics of his time, right? People were denying everything, right? How can they deny that they're doubting everything? Never they're thinking, right? So in some way, there's a great certitude in that, right? Even the skeptic has to admit that, right? I doubt, therefore I am. Couldn't doubt I exist, right? Okay. Tell me the story of these classes at some philosophy class years ago, and somebody asked, do I exist? The teacher's supposed to have said who's asking? It's obvious, right? Yeah. So it may not be that wisdom is most certain in the same way that it's about the most difficult things, right? It takes a long time to know a lot more about wisdom. I won't know. I'm just here to see that. Now the fourth thing is, he's the one more able to teach. You might want to put in brackets the causes, because he's going to kind of develop that more. So we think the wise man is more able to teach what? Others, right? Huh? So you can still read Heisenberg's lectures, right? You can go to the United States to teach the American physicists quantum theory, right? You still get the lectures there in the University of Chicago. Niels Bohr to get all the reporters out of the room, right? To explain the possibility of the A-bomb now, right? But the man who teaches seems to be what? Wiser, right? Than the men who are learning from him, right? Now the fifth thing he says about wisdom, that the one for itself and for the sake of knowing is more wisdom than that for the sake of its results. And they say that's more difficult for us to see in the modern world because this world is entirely given over to practical, right? As they say, you can see it to some extent that people would regard Shakespeare as wiser than any carpenter or plumber, right? And they would, when they make Einstein the man of the century, it's because he's supposed to have known something, right? But not in terms of Einstein particularly making something, right? Now the last one, of course, comes right out of what we saw. The chief artist is wiser than the man he commands. And the one ruling, the science that rules others, is more wisdom than the one obeying. For the wise man ought not to receive orders, but to give orders. He ought to direct others, right? He ought not to be persuaded by another, the less wise by him. So if anybody else directed the wise man, the other man would be the wise man, right? So the wise man directs everybody else, or wisdom is the knowledge that directs other knowledge, and not vice versa. That kind of comes out of what we saw. That we all think of the chief artist, right? Napoleon who commands, the head of the cavalry, right? The medical doctor who commands the pharmacist as being wise, right? So wisdom in the full sense is going to be the man who commands everybody else. This is the knowledge, right? That directs all the rest. Huh? So he knows all things in some way, right? In ways possible for man in general. He knows things difficult to know, right? He's more certain, right? He's more what? Able to teach. He has knowledge more honorable or desirable for its own sake. And he directs or commands or orders all others, right? Such and so many are the thoughts we have about wise men and wisdom. It takes either one because you can change one into the other easily, right? I say the wise man knows all things in some way. Wisdom is a knowledge of all things in some way, right? Turn one into the other easily. Now, you could reason from the first three to speak about the first causes, but in order to kind of separate these two things in our mind, he's going to, in the next three paragraphs, reason from the first three attributes of the wise man to his knowledge being a knowledge of what is said of all, what is most universal in that sense. And from the last three, he's going to reason for wisdom being a knowledge of first causes. Okay? And of course, people often confuse what is said of all with what is a cause of all, right? Two different meanings. In Latin, they speak of the universale and predicando, universal in being said of things, right? And then the universale in causando, right? And Thomas, in the first book of the Summa Contra Gentiles, he has one of those chapters devoted to showing that those two are not the same. And that God, right, who is the cause of all things, is not said of all things, right? Okay? The God who said, I am who am, is not the being which is said of all things. Okay? There's a whole chapter devoted to that. Hegel very clearly identifies the two. Look at Hegel's logic. Hegel identifies the being which is said of all things, right, with the one who said, I am who am. Terrible what? Confusion, right? And it leads to pantheism and things of that sort. If you look at the Ingridium Symbolorum in the 19th century, even the Catholic universities, the Catholic theologians and so on in Germany, they're always being corrected by Rome for their pantheistic tendencies, right? Even our own century, Clement and Rahner and so on, had a tendency to be somewhat pantheistic at times. And the other statements are more orthodox, But you see some of these quotes in them too, it's very questionable. So it's a very common thing. And Alexis de Tocqueville, in the chapter on the influence of democratic customs on the mind, says that it encourages pantheistic ideas of God. The force be with you. And you become a part of the force, right? So pantheism is something endemic in the 19th century and 20th century. 21st century. But there's a really gross confusion between said of all and cause of all. Two senses of universal being said of and universal and cause. You have the same thing with the English word general. Suppose you have an army out there, right? And everybody in the army is a soldier, right? It's very general, right? Break it down to captains, lieutenants, and privates and so on, right? But everybody is a what? Soldier. It's very general, right? Then you have, let's say, General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur, right? Is he general in the same sense as which soldier is? He's a real cause. Yeah, he's moving the whole army. He's directing the whole army, right? Is soldier directing the army? Soldier in general? Soldier in general is said of everything in the army, right? But doesn't have any causality for the whole army, does it? That's really a very gross confusion. But it's made by a lot of people. It's made by Hegel, I mean, most clearly in modern times. So. It's anticipated by Spinoza. That's why I always say Shakespeare is wiser than what the modern philosophers are. Because he puns the two senses of general, right? Introitus and preceded, black satire. And preceded comes over to the Greek camp, The general of the army, Agamemnon, right, is their kiss, right? Ulysses sees this, right? He's kind of a, hot issue here. And Ulysses says, she's been kissed by the general, but she hasn't been kissed in general yet. They all want to get to the act. This is the downfall of precedent, like this, with the loose woman, which very loose. But two different senses of general, right? Huh? So Shakespeare sees those two senses of general, right? But Hegel is confusing those two senses, huh? So although Aristotle could reason, from, let's say, wisdom being about the things most difficult to know, it's about the first causes, right? He doesn't reason from that. He reasons from the first three, that's about what is said of all, and from the last three to what is the cause of all. He wants to keep those two things distinct in our mind, just like Thomas does when he has a whole chapter devoted to that. God is the cause of all, but he's not said of all. People get mixed up when they say, well, being is said of everything, right? Everything that is, the being. Right? Everything that is can be said to be in some way, and therefore be a being. And God is what? It says, I am who am. So he's being itself. They can easily confuse the two, right? So Thomas has a whole chapter devoted to that, huh? Distinction between those two. It's like, Aristotle foresaw this, right? But to some extent, Plato made that confusion too. He wanted to take what was said of many and put it in the world by itself, and everything would partake of that. The man himself, apart from the individual man. Right? In a way, he's trying to make that same mistake. So let's see how he starts to reason now. So the first attribute of the wise man is that he knows all things in some way, right? Wisdom is a knowledge of all things in some way. But nobody could know all things, no man could know all things in particular. So he says of these, to know, it's next to the last paragraph in page 3. Of these, to know all things necessarily belongs to the man most of all having a knowledge universal. For he knows in some way all things placed on the universe. Someone might say, how can anybody know all things, right? Because there seems to be an infinity of things, right? But notice, do you know what an odd number is? Huh? You know what an even number is? And do you know that no odd number is even? Well, in a way, you're making a statement about how many things. Yeah, infinity of odd numbers, right? Infinity of even numbers. So in knowing universal, odd number, in a way I'm knowing an infinity of things. In knowing universal, even I'm knowing an infinity of things. In fortiori, you're knowing number, right? In knowing prime number and composite number, I know an infinity of things. Huh? Kind of obvious that there's an infinity of composite numbers, right? Euclid has a theorem, right, which shows there's an infinity of prime numbers too. Kind of marvelous, thing that he does. So in some way, I know an infinity of things, right? I know an universal. So if the wise man knows all things in some way, he must know what is most universal, right? Okay? Now, in the second thing, he says, and perhaps the most universal, let's use the word perhaps, right? Because the first cause is even more difficult to know, right? He says, and perhaps the most universal are the most difficult for men to know, for they are furthest from the what? Senses. So if the senses know the singular, that's the beginning of our knowledge, the most universal would seem to be furthest away, right? Okay. Now, if you have any experience of teaching philosophy, you'll notice this is a common statement, especially from women, but you know, this is so abstract, right? You know, I have a hard time understanding philosophy. It's so abstract, you know. You hear that again and again, right? And what does he mean when you say abstract? What do you mean? What? Yeah, it's very universal, right? Separated, right? Abstract means separated, right? That's a common thing. You know? They can do something more concrete. You know? So in some way it seems to be most difficult. Huh? That's why Thomas, in the question 117, Article 1 of the Prima Partis in the Theologiae, he has a question on the teacher, right? And he says the teacher has to lead the student from what? Propositiones minus universalis, from less universal statements, right? To understand more universal statements. And use sensibilia exempla, sensible examples and so on, right? Now the third thing about the wise man, or wisdom, is that the wise man is more sure than other men are. And wisdom is more certain than other sciences. Now, Aristotle recalls something that we learn in logic in the posterior analytics. It's a very same example he gives. Which is more certain, arithmetic or geometry? The reasoned out knowledge of numbers, or the reasoned out knowledge of lines and angles and plane and solid figures? Which is more certain? Yeah. Now, what's the reason why it's more certain than geometry? Yeah. And a lot of times they take the simplest thing in arithmetic, which is the 1, the unit, and the simplest thing in geometry, which is the point, right? And the point adds something to the 1. It's indivisible like the 1, but it has a position. It's here or there, right? So when I consider 3 points, they can all be on the same line or just 2 of them, right? And I consider the 3 ones of 3, I don't have to consider that way. Because they're not here or there, are they? It's more abstract science, huh? Okay. Now, if you study Euclid with the, Heath's edition, for example, right? The edition you had out there now, you read Brooks' edition or what? Is it Heath's notes?
We had both.
Yeah. Now, in Heath's notes, he reports what the great commentators like Berquist and so on point out about Euclid, right? That when he's in geometry, when he's proving a theorem, sometimes you have to distinguish a number of cases of that theorem, because the line can be drawn in position a little bit differently. And what they see is that Euclid doesn't give all the cases. His custom is to give the most difficult case. And leave the easier cases for us dumbbells, right? But the commentators, like Berquist and other ones, they will what? Distinguish other cases. Huh? And sometimes get carried away and distinguish too many cases. But down to the centuries, they've done this, right? Now, in arithmetic, you don't have to do that. Because the points can't be in a different position. Excuse me, the ones can't be in a different position. Okay? Now, I know from practice and experience that sometimes, when I'm thinking about the cases, have I distinguished all the necessary cases? And sometimes they say people distinguish more than is necessary that really aren't, And so you have to take into account what's found in the earth because of matter and the variations of matter and so on. But you don't have to consider in the geometrical sense. We talk about the shape of a tire, and the side view is what? Circular, right? But look at the tire out there in the parking lot. The bottom of the tire is flattened out, right? Does the geometry have to worry about the bottom of the circle getting flattened out? No. Because now you're adding something to sphere, circle, and so on, namely matter, right? So arithmetic is more certain than geometry. The geometry adds more to be considered, more to take into account. Natural philosophy is less certain than geometry because you add matter there, right? But now when you go from what man is by nature to 20th century or 21st century American man, now you're adding what? Yeah. Because man, 20th century American man, is what he is, not just by what he has by nature, but by what? Custom, and by choice and so on, right? So you have to consider many more things now, right, than you had to there, right? Talk about the Israelites and Palestinians, right? You consider they're human beings. You got to consider all these, things they're accustomed to do, choices they've made, and all this sort of thing, right? It's very complicated and very uncertain there, right? So, that's basically the order of certitude. Arithmetic, geometry, natural philosophy, and political philosophy. It's easier for me to count and be sure of the number of people here in this room today than to go to Yankee Stadium and be, sure that I've counted everybody, right? And the more things you have to take into account, the less sure you are, right? So that's the principle, right? Now, as you go to what's most universal, you have more or less things to consider. Yeah. As you go from the more universal to the less universal, you keep on adding, don't you? So I go from figure to plane figure to rectilinear plane figure to quadrilateral to square, right? I keep on adding more things to be taken into account. So in a way, if he talks about what is said of all, what's most universal, he has to take into account the least. And that is going to be more sure than anybody else. Kind of a subtle thing, right? I think there are many ways you could argue these three things. But Aristotle's reasoning from all of the first three things to his knowledge being most universal. It's about what is most universal, what is said of all. Okay? Now, from the last three, he's going to argue that it's about the first causes. And the science which considers causes, the second paragraph in page 4, is more fit for teaching. For those teach who give the causes of these things. So the man who can give what? Not only the cause, but the cause of the cause, he can what? Yeah. So why do these guys throwing things at each other down there? Because they hate each other, right? Okay. Now, why do they hate each other, right? The man who can teach the cause of the cause can teach more, right? It's all the way till they get to the what? First, right? He's most able to teach. Most of all human beings, right? And it's the cause that gives the effect, right? If you know the effect but not the cause, you're still kind of in the dark about this, right? So if he's seeking what's most knowable and what's most illuminating, he's seeking the first causes. Now, when you study the four kinds of causes, you realize that the chief cause is the end of purpose. And he says, that is the chief science, and more ruling than the subordinate, which knows that for the sake of which is the definition of end, each thing ought to be done. This, however, is the good of each, and as a whole, take all things into account, the best in all nature. If you knew the end or purpose of the whole universe, right, you always correct others by knowing the end, right? So the man who knows the end of the whole universe is most of all able to correct others. Of course, God is both the Alpha and the Omega, right? He became the end of all things. Now, the final conclusion here, this second reading. From all the foresaid, the name sought, namely wisdom, falls in the same science. For it is necessary that this looks at the first beginnings and causes. For one of the causes is the good, and that for the sake of which. And that's the end of the first of the two parts of the creative, right? What he's been showing up to this point is what is wisdom aiming at, right? And the Greek word skopos is the word we use when we talk about aiming at a target, right? Okay? So he's aiming at causes, and most of all at the what? First causes, or the first cause. Okay?
The sentence that says from all the force that the name thought falls in the same science. English then says name is wisdom.
Yeah,
now falls in the same science.
The science of the first causes. What we've been talking about. Now, how long can we go today? Continue to read here. Okay? Okay. Now, as I mentioned at the end of the frame, it's going to have an epilogue, right? We'll recall the second thing he did and the first thing he did, right? Now, in the third reading here, these readings are taken from Thomas's commentary, right? Okay. The third reading here is the second part of the premium. What kind of knowledge is wisdom? And Aristotle is going to say four things about the kind of knowledge wisdom is. And one will kind of lead into the next one. He's going to say that it's looking knowledge, right? Not practical knowledge. Sometimes you see the Greek word theoretical, that means looking knowledge. He's going to show that it's the most liberal knowledge there is. That's going to follow from its being the most looking knowledge. He's going to show that it's not human possession, because man is enslaved in many ways. And finally, he's going to show that it's the most honorable and the best knowledge, because it's the most divine. And one of these we'll see, it leads into the next one. Now, it is not a making, or generally we would say practical science. He's going to give two signs this knowledge is not but practical, but that it's for the sake of what? Understanding, right? And the first sign is going to be that it arose not because of hunger or thirst or something like that, but it arose from wonder. And therefore simply from the desire to know. So he says that it is not a making science is clear also from those first philosophizing. For men both now and at first begin to philosophize through wonder. This is something that Plato had said before Aristotle. I'll give you the text of that. Plato says, right? Socrates, huh? I'll give you the text. For men both now and at first began to philosophize through wonder. In the beginning, and this is an order of this, wondering about strange things close at hand. Then little by little, Then little by little, thus going forward, raising questions about the greater things, is about the change of the moon, and of the sun and the stars. And finally, about the very order of the universe. So the wonder grew, right? But the man in doubt and wondering thinks himself to be what? Ignorant, right? I'm going to come back to what he says about the philomuthos in a second. Hence, if men philosophize to escape ignorance, it is clear that they sought knowledge for the sake of understanding and not for any use. Okay? Now, he gives a little sign. What is a philomuthos? Yeah. Okay. A muthos first means a myth, something like our fairy tales. Right? Then mythos takes on the broader sense of any story. And finally, Aristotle uses the poetics for plot. Right? So the lover of fairy tales, right? The lover of stories, right? The lover of plots is in some way a philosopher. There's an affinity between the Philomuthos and the philosopher. And the likeness consists in that the myth is put together from what? Wonders, right? So a friend of my brother's who teaches literature says, great literature ends in wonder, and philosophy begins in wonder, right? So the great literature kind of aroused a kind of wonder in the Philomuthos, and this wonder is a stepping stone to the wonder of philosophy. Albert the Great, the teacher of Thomas, commenting in this passage, he says that great poetry, great fiction, dat modum admirandi. It teaches us how to what? Wonder, right? So it is not by chance that Homer came before the philosophers. Homer is the greatest of the poets, he's among the ancients. And the Iliad and the Odyssey and so on, they arouse a wonder which is not quite the wonder of the philosopher, is a stepping stone to that wonder. And it shows on decadence from moderns that they didn't become better philosophers under the influence of Shakespeare. Right? I know myself, though, when I was when I first got interested in philosophy, my brother Richard had the basic works of Aristotle there, right? And I'm kind of looking at all these books, right? And the book that got my attention was a book called The Politics, right? I was much involved in that in high school, right? Okay. But then when I became a freshman in college, I was in a special class getting with my grammar and so on, right? And we were doing interesting things, and the professor says, we're going to read some Shakespeare you probably never read in high school. So I read a number of Shakespeare's plays, and of course, and this was the occasion for my to get a complete volume of Shakespeare, right? And I read all of Shakespeare's plays that freshman year. And we're doing historical sense. But that completed my transition from what? A man concerned with the fate of his country to what? A philosopher, right? Like wonder, huh? That Shakespeare arouses, right? It's only a poet like Homer or Sophocles or Shakespeare that really arouses that wonder, huh? Shakespeare's farewell to the stage, The Tempest, right? Miranda, her name is taken from wonder. Really, a lot of wonderful things in there. So Aristotle is saying there's an affinity of the Philomuthos to the philosopher. And sometimes people, become a Philomuthos as kind of a substitute for being a philosopher. There's something like the philosopher, right? Okay. My brother Richard was very much interested in fiction, drama, all these sort of things. Right? He eventually became a philosopher, right? So it's the Philomuthos on the way to being a philosopher. So Monsignor Diane, he agreed when I said that there would have been no philosophers without Homer. And they say Albert is very insistent upon that. It's just how to wonder. And so I've never known a good philosopher who's not a Philomuthos. I've known a Philomuthos who's not a philosopher, but I've never known a philosopher who's not a Philomuthos. So this is very, brought in here to bring out that philosophy did begin in wonder, right? And therefore, if it had begun in hunger, or thirst, or desire to get warm, or then it would have led to something practical, right? Like the art of hunting or the art of farming, whatever, right? The fact that it began in wonder, and that desire of something to know, is a sign that it's like looking now, right? I'm going to give you another page, a page. There's the three main texts that I know of with the Greeks on wonder, right? And I'll reproduce the things here from this Ukrainian. But what's renewed to you is the text from Plato. Theaetetus, and then a nice fragment of Democritus. Democritus, this fragment said, I would rather discover one cause than be master of the king of the Persians. So I have to explain to the students, that was the greatest king in the world at that time. So if I was master of the king of the Persians, I'd be the wealthiest man in the world, right? I read that they had 1,000 chefs prepare dinner every night. Wasn't good, I'm sure they had a harem, and so all the things the men want, right? The master of the kingdom of the Persians has good sense. But Democritus says, I would rather discover one cause than be master of the Persians. Intense wonder of the philosopher, right? Plato's very nice text on this in the Theaetetus, so I'll give you a copy of in the class here. Now the second sign that Aristotle gives, what happened witnesses this. When almost all necessary things and those recreation and amusement existed, then such knowledge as philosophy began to be sought, right? So it is clear that we seek this knowledge through no other need. I sometimes witness that with my own family, right? I come from a family of 3 boys, and we're all philosophers. And my mother always tries to wake you up, right? Now my father was a businessman, right? My grandfather was a blacksmith. My grandfather came over from Sweden at the age of 15, and he became the blacksmith at Berquist, Minnesota, right? And you think you're going to be philosophizing this man? No. See, this is very tiring work, right? Huh? Yeah. So would my father be a philosopher, being the son of the blacksmith? No. And in fact, Berquist, at the time my father was a boy, such a little town, it didn't even have a high school. So my father wanted to go to high school. He went to college, right? He wanted to go to high school at least, right? So he went to Alexandria, Minnesota, which is a larger town, not too far, Berquist, and he enrolled in the high school, right? But he had to support himself to go through the high school, right? So he worked in a shop that he found, right? But he didn't make enough money to be able to afford a room. So he asked the owner of the shop if he could sleep in the shop at night. The guy felt sorry for him, so he let him work in the shop at night. Right? Now, do you think my father is thinking of philosophizing? See? So my father, he's an intelligent man, right? If he had more education, he knows he would have done, right? But eventually, he got into a managerial position, right? And men with money started to back him up, right? And eventually he got his own company, right? Okay? But now, there was a little bit of, a little bit of money, My father always made us work in the summer, sitting around, right? But he always helped us, and you get as much education as you can, right? He ends up with 3 sons who are philosophers, right? Isn't that what Aristotle's talking about, right? I was no philosopher in my grandfather's generation. In my father's generation, all of a sudden you got these 3, right? I see my children, I'm not as wealthy as a professor, and they do other things, right? You're going to be 3rd generation philosopher. But that's the side Aristotle's talking about. I can see it in my own family, right? And so the average student sometimes gets a little interest in philosophy, but I didn't make a living, right? And there's truth to that, obviously, right? Aristotle talked about it. So those are the 2 signs, but the main one is from wonder, right? It's just knowledge, looking knowledge. Now the second thing he says about this knowledge is that it's liberal as opposed to servile, right? Now most people don't understand the origin of the term liberal education and servile education, but it goes back to not only the Romans, but all the way back to the Greeks, if I didn't Plato. And of course all those societies had free men and slaves, right? And by an analogy, proportion to the difference between a free man and a slave in that society, that they called some knowledge liberal or free, and others servile or slavish. Now, the obvious difference between the free man and the slave is that the slave exists not for his own sake. The slave exists for the sake of the master. I'm not saying that's good or bad. That's the fact, right? Okay? By the master, he exists, the free man, he exists for his own sake, right? So by analogy to that difference, in knowledge that's not for its own sake, but for the sake of picking shoes, or for the sake of making dinner, or whatever it might be, right, is called servile or slavish. And this is very common, right through Shakespeare's time, just think of the servile arts. Sometimes they call it mechanical arts. By liberal knowledge, it would be a knowledge that's desirable for its own sake. And what we call the liberal arts is like the beginning of that, liberal knowledge for its own sake. But wisdom is the most liberal. Yeah. But notice you can reason from it being looking knowledge to it being liberal. Because looking means it's for the sake of doing, right? For its own sake. And therefore it's liberal or free, right? But as we call a man free that is for himself and not for another. So this alone is free among the sciences, because to some extent they're all studied for the sake ultimately of wisdom, right? For this alone is only good at for the sake of itself, right? A little passage of Thomas who says, I study the body, he says, so I can study the soul. And I study the soul, he says, so I can study the angels. And I study the angels so I can study God. And that's it. And I said God really helps, isn't it? So the knowledge of God is what? The first cause is most for its own sake, right? See? The lower kinds of knowledge to some extent is the higher kinds. Now, you can see Aristotle's common sense here in the next paragraph. Because what is the condition of man? He has all kinds of needs, right? And in many, conditions of man, he could spend his whole day trying to get the necessities of life and still not what? Get them every day, right? So he says, hence it might justly be thought that it is not a human possession. Now he's not contradicting himself when he talked before about the natural desire to know, right? Because that indicated that in some way it's possible, right? But in saying it's not a human possession, he means it's not the sort of thing that you can use and pursue anytime you want to. Because you have all these practical needs, right? Okay. For in many ways, he says, the nature of man is enslaved. Some people point to this as an indication that Aristotle had some awareness of the effects of original sin, right? Okay. But in a way, my reason is enslaved to my what? Body and its needs, right? And to some extent, I got to paint the house this summer. My reason is enslaved to my house, right? And I got to get, food, get the money to buy the food, right? Okay. So there's some kinds of slavery we can't avoid, right? But then I used to teach political philosophy of all the old days, talking about slavery. He says, today each man is his own slave, he says. You see? So in a sense, if you have a house or a yard, or most likely you're going to be cutting the grass yourself and paying the house yourself, unless you have an awful lot of money, right? So in a way, you're enslaved to your possession, right? You're enslaved to your what? Car, right? I get up here and say, someday I'll get a flat tire, no better. It's all the house, right? So we're out there in the sticks, I don't show up, because the day you finally get the flat tire. You know how complicated it is, we're out in the countryside there, and you gotta, get somebody to tow you or something, right? Now, in addition to that, men are slaves, what? Of their passion, right? I was quoting Hamlet's words there. Give me that man that is not passion slave. So some men are a slave of their own fear. Some men are a slave of their own anger, right? Some men are a slave for their desire to eat or drink, for their sexual desire, right? Men are very often enslaved to some passion, right? And that makes it difficult for them to pursue knowledge. Altogether liberal for its own sake, right? You know, they can maybe do something about being enslaved to their passions, but they can't do much about being enslaved to their body in a way. It's got to be fed, right? Their car, their house, whatever it is, they have to have in their society, right? And then we're enslaved to what? Custom, right? Shakespeare calls custom a tyrant, right? Enslaved to fashion. I'm not enslaved to fashion, right? So if you wear the same clothes every day, you've been freed from one kind of unnecessary slavery, right? And Aristotle, kind of continuing that, quotes the poet, because when rejected the poet says, thus, according to Simonides, the Greek poet, God alone can have this honor, right? As if this is more a divine possession than a human possession. This knowledge is desirable for its own sake. Man, however, is not worthy to seek knowledge for itself. Right? Now, that's a very old idea in man's natural religion. Want to do that? If you look in the world historian there, McNeil, in the best world history book we have called it. In the beginning there, he has a picture of a Sumerian religious base, and it's got 3 levels on the base. The lowest level are the beasts, the middle level is the men, and the highest level are the gods, right? And apparently the theology behind it is that the animals were created to relieve man of some of his labor, like the horse and the ox and so on, right? And man was created to relieve the gods of labor, right? So it's only the gods, this is what the gods are. It's only the gods that have this knowledge for its own sake, right? Okay? And then if you try to pursue that knowledge, you're trying to pursue a divine prerogative, and God will be envious of you, right? Okay? And so he says, if the poets are saying something, right, and the divine is able to envy, it is likely especially to happen about this. It's an excellent knowledge. And unfortunate are all those who excel in knowledge, he says, right? But then he rejects this opinion of the poet, right? But the divine is not able to be envious, right? I know it's enviously formed for sadness. You can't think of sadness in God, right? And envy is over what? The good of another that seems to prevent your good, right? Nothing to prevent God's goodness, right? So Aristotle is saying it's impossible for God to be envious. And according to the Proverbs, poets say many false things. Notice what Christ says there about Martha and Mary. Mary represents what? Contemplatism, right? And Martha the practical, right? And Martha comes to complain to Christ about Mary not helping her with the meal, right? And Christ says, Mary hath chosen the better part. And secondly, and it shall not be taken away from her. Right? And when they comment on that, Thomas and the church fathers, they say, well, there's 2 lives, the contemplative life and the active life, right? And just like Rachel and Leah represent these 2 lives in the Old Testament, so there's 2 in the New Testament. But the active life goes up to the end of this life, but the contemplative life begins in this life and continues in a fuller way in the next world. So Mary had chosen the better part, and that's the part that God should stay have eternal, right? And it shall not be taken away from her. It continues this life, right? So he's not envious, obviously, right? Christ, right? He wants to share that knowledge which he has in himself, huh? Now he comes to the 4th and the crowning attribute. You notice how the 3rd one, in a way, has indicated that this is something more divine about this knowledge of human, right? And so that makes a transition to this being the most divine knowledge. and therefore it's being the most honorable and the best knowledge. Nor must any other knowledge be thought to be more honorable, for the most divine is the most honorable. And now he's going to show in what way this knowledge is most divine. He says there are two ways you could call knowledge divine. What are the two ways? Yeah. There's two ways you speak of knowledge as divine, right? Just as there's two ways you speak of knowledge as human. It's knowledge that human beings have, right? Or it's knowledge about human things, right? Okay? And some knowledge might be human in one way, not the other. Okay? But some knowledge, with this terrible word humanities, right? It's supposed to be human in both senses, right? Human in the sense that human beings have it, but they also have chemistry, right? But human also in the sense it's about human things, right? So Aristotle is going to argue that wisdom is divine in both senses of divine. It's about God, and it's a kind of knowledge that God most of all has. The most divine is only in two ways, this can be said. For that which God most of all would have is the most divine of sciences. And if it were of divine things, right? There's two ways you can call knowledge divine. It's about God, or God has it. Okay? But this alone has both of these. For God seems to all to give them the cause. He's not going to make this point. You've got to put that in book 12, right? This is book 1. But he's taking the common, reasonable opinion of the Greek philosophers that God seems among all to be among the first causes, right? So if this knowledge, the wisdom is about the first causes, and the first cause is God, or includes God, then obviously wisdom is about God, right? That's a syllogism, right? Okay? And then, from the common opinion, of Pythagoras and Heraclitus and Socrates and Plato, all the Greek philosophers, who either they wouldn't want to say that man is wise at all, some inferior way, right? Either God alone is wise, or else want to say man is wise in some imperfect way, right? So he says, such knowledge God alone, or most of all, would have. Okay? So if you take wisdom in the fullest sense, God alone would have this knowledge, right? Or God would have it most of all, right? Would have it in some perfect way. So notice the main syllogism, right? Wisdom is the most divine knowledge. The most divine knowledge is the most honorable knowledge, right? Therefore, wisdom is the most honorable knowledge, right? Okay. Now, he takes as obvious that what is most divine is most honorable, right? But the minor premise that wisdom is the most divine, he says, well, it can be divine in two ways, and in both ways wisdom is divine, right? It seems to be about God, and he proves that by the middle term, that this is about the first causes, and the first cause is God, right? Therefore, wisdom is about God. And then he proves that God most of all have this from the common opinion of all the wise philosophers. Now, in the next paragraph, he says, all other kinds of knowledge are more necessary than this, but none is what? Better, right? So he's saying that this is not only the most honorable knowledge, but the what? Best knowledge. This agrees with what he says there in the beginning of the Dianima, where he says that one knowledge is better than another because it's more certain, or because it's about a better thing, right? But in the parts of animals, he says that the criterion about being about a better thing is more important. Okay? And he gives a very good example, and a very kind of spiritual way. He says, just as the glimpse, he says, of those we love is more to us than a leisurely view of those who don't care for. So I give students the example, you're working for your boss is curmudgeon, you see the boss clearly all day long, watching you to make sure you're... And then at noontime you run down 2-3 blocks to see your girlfriend or something, right? Or you see her out the window over there, right? and you enjoy more the little glimpse of her than this long view of the boss, you know. You see? So even to see it perfect is like love, right? So, so this knowledge then is what? It's looking knowledge, not practical, right? It's liberal and not servile, right? It's not a human possession, right? But it's the most honorable and the best knowledge because it's the most divine knowledge. But notice how he says all other kinds of knowledge are more necessary, right? And it's nice to see that contrast between necessary and better. It asks students, which is better, to breathe or to philosophize? But they all say to breathe, right? And I said, well now, why do you say to breathe is better than to philosophize? Of course, not breathing or anything else, right? And I say to them, well that shows that it's more necessary, right? But do you live for the sake of breathing? Or do you breathe for the sake of doing other things in life? If you breathe for the sake of something else that you want to do, but you have to breathe before you can do it, and that other thing is what's better, right? The end is always better. So this is the best knowledge, but all these other kinds of knowledge, like carpentry and cooking, and more necessary, right? It's, it is necessary, however, to place the possession of this in the opposite for us of the searches in the beginning. For all begin, as we have said, from wondering if things are thus. And it's about things that happen wonderfully by chance. And even the Philomu thoughts on it. You read the great, things like Oedipus the King or something like that, even Shakespeare's great tragedies, you see how these chance events are always wonder, right? Aristotle gives a very simple example in the Critics there where somebody murdered somebody, right? And they didn't discover who had done the murder, right? The man murdered was a very great citizen, so they set up a large statue to him in the marketplace, right? One day there's a big festival and there's huge crowds, and the statue falls over on top of somebody and kills him. Just so it fell on him. The man had murdered him, right? Let's see something like that, right? And how at the end of Romeo and Juliet, right? You got these two powerful, noble families of Verona, right? Who are feuding, to the point of shedding blood, right? Hate each other, right? And their only son and their only daughter, right? Fall in love, right? And finally reconcile, right? To the death of him. So the Duke at the end, grabs these two guys, says, heaven has found means to punish you for your, Seems to be some significance there, right? They hate each other so much, right? They should lose their only son for one and the daughter, right? To the love in a sense of the only son and daughter, right? Seems to be something hidden there, right? Arouses wonder. Right? Strange and wonderful situations. Or about the turnings of the sun, he says, right? The sun goes up the sky, right? At different times of year, it's lower and higher in the sky. And he takes the most famous example from geometry. The Greeks discovered that the diagonal of the square and the side are not commensurable. They're amazed at this, right? That's contrary to what they expected, right? And Thomas Aquinas is stopping on this, he says that even things that we don't know the cause of, they don't arouse our wonder so much if they're familiar, right? But if something contrary to what we expect takes place, right? Then we wonder about the cause, right? If I let go of this glass and fell to the ground and broke, right? You wouldn't wonder about it, would you? Even though Einstein says we don't know why things fall to the ground. And Schreiber didn't say, I don't know why either. But if I let go of this glass and went up, then you wonder why it went up, right? Because it's contrary to what you expect. And Einstein, when he talks about wonder, mentions that same point, right? That when something's contrary to what you expect. When his father got home a magnet, he had to experience a magnet. And the magnet seemed to move something without being in contact with it. And that amazed him, right? Because his experience of one body moving another was always through what? Contact, right? And here, this thing not in contact, apparently, moving. And I was wondering. back at the speech. My God became man. You shouldn't wonder, right? My God became man. So at the end of philosophy, you have something better than wondering. You have knowledge, right? Now the last paragraph here on page 5 is the epilogue, right? And he recounts what is done in the third reading first, right? What is the nature of the knowledge sought then has been said? It's looking knowledge, it's liberal or free, right? It's not a human possession, but it's the most honorable and best knowledge, it's the most divine knowledge. Right? And what is the goal that the investigation and the whole knowledge overroad must reach? And that's the first cause. Aristotle doesn't arrive at the knowledge of the first causes until the 12th book, second half of the 12th book. Once he arrives at God, it's the first cause. Yeah? That's his kind of goal, right? So, that's what a philosopher is a lover of. This knowledge here that is really what it is. Now, the next question is, how must the philosopher love wisdom, right? And there's about 4 or 5 things you have to say about that, right? The first and most basic thing, to really be called a philosopher, you have a right to the name of a philosopher, right? Not only do you have to love wisdom, but you have to love wisdom for its own sake. If I love wisdom for the sake of making money, or I love wisdom for the sake of the power it gives me, or if I love wisdom for the sake of the honor and glory that comes from being regarded as wise, right? Am I really a lover of wisdom? No. They tell the student, if the man loves the woman for her money, does he really love the woman? And if the woman gets suspicious and says, you love me or my money, in a fit of honesty says, I love you for your money, she undoubtedly will follow that, but you know you love me. Right? Okay? So if I don't love wisdom for its own sake, if I love it for the sake of honor and glory, I'm a sopher, right? If I love it for the sake of power, I'm a lover of power, right? So that's the first thing. You have to love wisdom for its own sake to really be a philosopher in the full sense. Now, if I love more than wisdom for its own sake, let's say I love candy for its own sake. If I love candy more than wisdom, would you call me a philosopher? Call me a lover of what? Candy. When I was a little boy, I thought my father was a very foolish man. Because if there's money, you could fill the refrigerator with orange soda, grape soda, fruit, right? Each one of those little foreign grocery stores, you know, from the one-armed man, actually, one-armed. And in the front of the little store was this big water cooler, you know, with orange and grape and get up money to go buy it anyway. And I always, you know. So I said, my father didn't know how to use his money, obviously, you know. With his money, he could, you know, have the whole refrigerator full of this, and big soda all day long, and be a happy man, right? Now, my father gave my brother Richard 10 cents a week an ounce. He gave my brother Marcus 5 cents a week. Me being the youngest, he gave 2 cents a week. Now, in those days, you could buy a orange soda for 5 cents. That's us. What do? You get 2 cents allowance. You go down to the penny candy store and blow the 2 cents. You can get by it, penny candy. Right, save up for a few weeks, and then get a soda, and you put it with the candy. So my father didn't know how to use the money, right? So if I love candy or soda more than wisdom, I'm more a lover of candy. I love the music of Mozart, for example, right? If I love the music of Mozart more than wisdom, is more classifiable as what? A lover of music, right? A lover of music, right? Okay. So you have to love wisdom for its own sake, and more than anything else, you love for its own sake. Right? You have to love wisdom. Now the third thing, if you love wisdom for its own sake, and you love it more than anything else you love for its own sake, then you're really loving wisdom as the end or goal of your life, aren't you? Because the end is what? Desired for its own sake, and more than anything else, right? So that's the third thing to read a philosopher. You have to love wisdom as the very end or goal of your life. Life. Now the fourth, if you make it too if you wanted to, it's more difficult to see. You really have to love wisdom as a common good. Wisdom is the common good of reason, and to some extent the common good of mankind. When we speak of a common good, we don't mean necessarily that all are sharing in it, but it's a good which is able to be shared by many. It should be shared by many, right? Okay. You find out, for example, with wisdom, the knowledge of truth belongs most of all to wisdom, right? And to really love wisdom, you have to love it as a common good. Like St. Augustine says in the Confessions there, right? But I love this truth because I discovered it. And me loving my honor or glory, right? Not truth, right? And I should love the truth that you discovered as much as the one I discovered. In fact, what you discovered might be even greater than what I discovered. So if I love the truth that I discovered more than the greater truth you discovered, am I a lover of truth? Huh? Yeah. So we really have to love truth as a common good. You read Thomas and St. Augustine there, some chapters in John that talks about the origin of his teaching, right? How the devil speaks from himself privately. In a sense, when you read the modern philosophers, each one has his own private philosophy. So to speak. So you can distinguish then these 4 or 5 things. Huh? You must love wisdom for its own sake, right? You must love it more than anything else he loves for its own sake. You must love it, therefore, as the very end and purpose of his life. And 4, you must love it as a common good. Both the common good of reason, as you study wisdom, you find out that it perfects the whole of our knowledge in some way, the end of all. Okay? It's not a particular good, right? It's the common good of the whole reason. And it's also, in some sense, a common good of mankind. Okay? So you have to love it as a common good. Well, maybe the theoretical. But even with the moderns, with the horrible things that rose in Marxist philosophy and so on, they were a rejection of working knowledge. Isn't that? That's where it began. Against working knowledge.